Elizabeth Lee Miller was a woman of extraordinary contradictions, scandalous, brilliant, and utterly fearless. Born in small-town America, her early years were shaped by an unspeakable act of violence, but she emerged from those shadows with a fiery determination. From wild tantrums to dancing amidst the glamour and scandals of New York, from gracing the cover of Vogue at just 19 to becoming the muse, and later the apprentice, of the legendary Man Ray, her life was a whirlwind of intensity and intrigue. She shared love affairs with luminaries like Charlie Chaplin and Picasso, but it was in the devastation of World War II that she underwent her greatest transformation. As the first female photojournalist on the front lines of Europe, Lee's camera immortalized the brutal horrors of war and the profound resilience of the human spirit, a war that ultimately tore her apart. Model, muse, photographer, housewife, and war correspondent, her life was an unrelenting testament to courage, creativity, and survival. Join us as we delve into the extraordinary, untamed life of Lee Miller, a woman who refused to let the world define her. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. We post new videos every week, and we'd love to have you join our growing community. Now, let's dive into the scandalous life of Lee Miller. Elizabeth Miller, who would later be known to the world as Lee, was born on April 23, 1907. Her family, a blend of privilege and eccentricity, would shape the very core of her identity. As the second child of Theodore and Florence Miller, Elizabeth quickly captured her father's heart. Theodore, a man of innovation and intellect, was far from ordinary. A scientist and inventor, he served as the superintendent of the De La Balle Separator Company, the largest employer in the city. At home, he transformed their lives with modern wonders, installing electricity and running water long before such luxuries were commonplace. He fueled Elizabeth's curiosity, teaching her to think critically, write with both hands, and observe the world with an analytical eye. A camera, gifted to her at a young age, sparked a passion for photography that would later become her defining legacy, touching not only her life, but the world beyond. But Theodore's influence was not confined to the scientific realm. He often photographed Elizabeth, even in nude poses, a practice considered artistic within the family, but one that would certainly raise eyebrows today. Still, it was often said that her father was the only man she ever truly trusted. These intimate, unconventional moments shaped Elizabeth's complex relationship with the camera, not just as a tool, but as a mirror to her evolving image. She became her father's favored subject, with these photography sessions continuing well into her adulthood. While Theodore fostered her intellectual and artistic development, her mother, Florence, played a different role. A nurse from humble beginnings in Canada, Florence had married into the higher circles of local society. Though she hosted tea parties and fulfilled her social duties as expected, she never commanded Elizabeth's admiration the way Theodore did. Elizabeth's childhood was a wild tapestry of adventure and exploration. She spent her days building water wheels with her brothers, climbing trees, camping, and fishing, activities her father wholeheartedly encouraged. But this carefree existence came to a shattering halt when Elizabeth was just 7 years old. While Theodore was away on business and Florence was recovering from illness, Elizabeth was sent to stay with close family friends from Sweden. It was there that a male family member assaulted her. YouTube will not allow me to say the word, but this traumatic event left her emotionally scarred and physically ill, an affliction that would recur throughout her life. Her recovery was agonizing. Elizabeth was isolated, subjected to painful treatments, while her brothers could hear her cries from behind closed doors as her mother administered daily irrigations at home. Everything she touched had to be disinfected, heightening her sense of contamination and alienation. This profound sense of otherness would follow her for years to come. In an attempt to heal her mind, her parents took her to a psychologist who sought to help her separate love from sex. But the damage was already done. Her brother John later reflected, it changed her whole life and attitude. She was never quite the same. She just went wild. From then until her departure at 19, Elizabeth's moods cast long shadows over the Miller household. Theodore, ever the protector and enabler, indulged her every whim, while Florence, growing increasingly desperate, struggled to understand her daughter's wild spirit. Elizabeth's tempestuous nature often led to dramatic outbursts, running away from home or throwing tantrums that left her belongings scattered in frustration. Her intellect was undeniable, but the rigid confines of formal education did little to capture her interest. She rejected the classroom's order and preferred the uncharted terrain of self-discovery, whether through chemistry experiments, peering into the family stereoscope, or devouring books. Teachers saw her as spoiled. Classmates called her a show-off. Yet Elizabeth remained unmoved, defiant against their judgments. At family dinners, she sparred with her sharp wit, debating economics and Thomas Edison's inventions with a ferocity that unsettled even her father's friends. She was a force, driven not by convention, but by a deep inner hunger to challenge the ordinary. And as World War I raged across Europe, Elizabeth sought her place in this changing world. Knitting socks for refugees as part of her Red Cross efforts, she posed proudly in her uniform, but this fleeting sense of purpose left her cold. She hated the propaganda films at the local theater and instead found escape in Hollywood stars, dragging her friend Minnow to the movies, where they mimicked the glamour of actresses like Lena Cavaliere, Louise Brooks, and Wallace Reed. Yet it wasn't the stars themselves that fascinated Elizabeth, it was the directors and writers, those unseen architects of narrative and image who captivated her imagination. At 14, Elizabeth found a new stage in local theater, slipping into roles like the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Here, acting deepened her love for the arts, allowing her to play with identity and explore her expressive nature. But school was another battlefield. She was expelled from one school for splashing water in a cooking class, from another for pulling pranks and smoking, and a third for convincing a fellow student to drink blue dye, sending the girl into hysterics when her urine turned blue. Each incident seemed a further defiance of the constraints society placed upon her. Florence, meanwhile, became increasingly desperate. She blamed Theodore for spoiling their daughter, their once harmonious household now simmering with tension. Florence herself was weighed down by depression, crushed by Theodore's numerous affairs, and the emotional gulf between her and Elizabeth. In a moment of despair, Florence attempted to end her life, but was saved by Theodore just in time. Months of recovery followed in the hospital, and while Florence eventually sought the help of a Freudian therapist, against Theodore's wishes, her slow path to healing led her to local theater and trips to New York City. In these brief escapes, she rediscovered a sense of joy, and mother and daughter began to mend their fractured relationship. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's own journey was one of transformation. She completed her final year of school at Putnam Hall, attending as a day student, her thoughts already far beyond her city. She dreamed of Europe, a place of culture, art, and freedom. Determined to prepare, she threw herself into the study of French and took her dramatic pursuits seriously, performing in plays and exploring the world of interpretive dance. Each new performance, each step on the stage emboldened her, fueling her growing independence. By the time Elizabeth graduated, she had fully embraced the spirit of the Roaring Twenties. With her hair bobbed and her wardrobe tailored like a man's, she became the embodiment of the flapper, a symbol of rebellion and freedom. Elizabeth echoed the words of Zelda Sayre, who famously said of the flapper, "You always know what she thinks, but she does all her feeling alone." Elizabeth's long-awaited escape to Europe came in the summer of 1925, arranged by her French teacher, who was spending the season in France with a companion. The plan was simple, a stop in Nice, where Elizabeth would attend finishing school. Theodore, surprisingly agreeable to his daughter's pursuit of adventure, approved the journey. Elizabeth, consumed with excitement, left for Paris with visions of the world opening before her. In what could only be described as a scene from Vanity Fair, the French teacher, a Polish woman still struggling with the language, unknowingly booked them into a Maison du Pays, a hotel that doubled as a brothel. "It took my chaperones 5 days to catch on," Elizabeth later recalled, "but I thought it was divine. I was hanging out of the windows, watching everything. I felt like the whole world was opening up in front of me." Her innocence collided with the city's vibrant, seductive energy, and Paris immediately laid claim to her heart. "One look at Paris," she declared, "and I said, 'This is mine. This is my home.'" Her initial plans to attend finishing school quickly evaporated. Elizabeth wired her parents, boldly informing them that she was staying in Paris. To her delight, Theodore agreed, and even increased her allowance, allowing her to rent a small maid's room. From that point forward, Elizabeth threw herself into the city's intoxicating rhythm. She worked as a guide, took classes, and immersed herself in the arts. Paris, in the autumn of 1925, was the epicenter of cultural revolution. The Dadaists were evolving into Surrealists. Gertrude Stein's salons buzzed with great thinkers, and Hemingway was writing The Sun Also Rises. Elizabeth found herself at the heart of this intellectual storm, though at the time, her world still revolved around theater and stage design. It was in this world that she met Hungarian artist Ladislas Medjis, who became her mentor. She affectionately referred to him as Maestro, while he called her Mouse, their relationship hinting at an intimacy beyond mere teacher and student. Under his guidance, Elizabeth's creativity flourished. Medjis, recognizing her potential, recommended her for a job at an art theater, where she began solving complex design problems and bringing dramatic visions to life on stage. "This was my university," Elizabeth later said of Paris. "All the quarters and theaters were my teachers." For the first time, she felt completely in control of her destiny, liberated by the city's possibilities. When her parents visited that autumn, they toured the city, dining at the finest restaurants and soaking in the Parisian atmosphere. Florence, however, uneasy with her daughter's new independence, decided to stay behind as a chaperone for the rest of the year. Yet, upon returning home in January 1926, Elizabeth's newfound freedom was abruptly cut off. She spiraled into a deep depression, mourning the life she had left behind in Paris, and stayed in bed for a month. Once she recovered, Elizabeth attempted to rekindle her creative spirit by enrolling in a dramatic production course at Vassar, where students wrote, directed, and staged their own plays. She dabbled in lighting design and acting, but found the limitations of her hometown stifling. Her ongoing health issues flared up, forcing her into a restrained celibate life. Though she still engaged in flirtations, intimacy remained elusive. She developed a close friendship with a local man named Harold, whom she found intellectually lacking. Nonetheless, she guided him through books and conversations, attempting to shape his mind. In her diary, Elizabeth confessed, "I long to be loved just once and chastely, but I feel it is too late to be anything but an animal." Her unresolved childhood trauma hung like a dark cloud over her, distorting her understanding of love and relationships. Seeking solace, Elizabeth often escaped to New York on weekends, attending plays and dissecting them with a critical eye. It was here, in the city's vibrant theater scene, that her passion for the stage was reignited. She joined the Provincetown Players, a theater collective renowned for its experimental approach, and found herself drawn once more to the bohemian atmosphere of Greenwich Village. The ideas, the conversations, the creativity, it all reminded her of Paris. By the spring of 1926, Elizabeth's yearning for the arts led her to take dance lessons in New York. The following month, she landed a position as a chorus girl in George White's Scandals, a revue known for its racy costumes and mass appeal. The famous Louise Brooks had danced there, and now Elizabeth found herself in similar company. The costumes barely concealed the performers' bodies, yet while many showgirls dreamed of wealthy husbands or film careers, Elizabeth remained unimpressed. "All they do is chat about boys and sex," she remarked, seeing through the superficial desires of her peers. However, illness once again intervened, and Theodore insisted Elizabeth return home to recover. During this time, tragedy struck. On a hot summer day, Elizabeth and Harold went rowing on a lake. Their unspoken attraction simmered beneath the surface. But when Harold attempted to impress her by diving from the boat, he disappeared beneath the water. Horrified, Elizabeth watched helplessly as authorities dragged the lake, eventually pulling Harold's lifeless body from the depths. His mother, grief-stricken, blamed Elizabeth, accusing her of leading him on with her sensuality. The incident deepened Elizabeth's already profound fears about herself, about the darker half of her soul, the one she often referred to as the animal. Crushed by the weight of the tragedy, Elizabeth left home as soon as she could and returned to New York. She took a job as a lingerie model, immersing herself in the theater world once more, hoping the distractions would ease her grief. But fate had a curious way of intervening. One afternoon, while walking the streets of New York, Elizabeth nearly stepped into oncoming traffic. At the last moment, a well-dressed stranger pulled her back. None other than Condé Nast, the legendary founder of Vogue magazine. Fascinated by her striking appearance, he invited her to his office and asked if she would pose for the magazine. In 1927, Vogue was in the midst of a cultural shift, embracing modernity, short hair, cubism, and the vibrant energy of New York City. Elizabeth, with her ethereal beauty and sharp wit, fit perfectly into this new era of high fashion. She graced the cover of Vogue in March, just before her 20th birthday, and overnight became a sensation. Renowned photographers clamored to work with her, and she was soon the darling of New York's elite. Elizabeth's social life blossomed in tandem with her career. She mingled with celebrities, writers, dancers, and artists, moving through café society with ease. At parties, she rubbed elbows with figures like George Gershwin, Fred Astaire, and members of the Vanderbilt family. It was around this time that she was advised to change her name to the more androgynous Lee. She embraced the suggestion, later remarking that her career truly began the day she became Lee Miller. The ambiguity of the name would serve her well in the male-dominated world of photography, where clients were often unsure whether they were hiring a man or a woman. Lee's life was a whirlwind of glamour and excitement, with suitors vying for her attention. One of her closest companions was Alfred de Liagre Jr., a witty Broadway director, with whom she shared an intimate yet unconventional relationship. At the same time, she dated his friend, a Canadian aviator named Argyle. Her New York years were filled with adventure, but beneath the surface, Lee was haunted by conflicting emotions. "I looked like an angel, but I was a fiend inside," she later admitted to a reporter, hinting at the internal turmoil that lingered from her past. In 1929, one of Lee's professional photos was used in an advertisement for Kotex, a women's hygiene product. She was outraged, having had no idea that her image would be used for such a campaign. The ad caused a scandal, especially back home, where her modeling career had already shocked many. Yet, as the ad eventually faded from circulation, Lee began to embrace the boldness of the move, taking pride in the stir it caused. Her modeling career lasted only 2 years, but by the end of it, Lee knew she wanted to move from in front of the camera to behind it. "After all, I was practically raised in a dark room," she quipped. Her passion for photography was rekindled, and she began taking classes. However, the thrill of New York had started to wane. At 22, with an introduction to the head of photography at French Vogue waiting for her, Lee decided to return to Paris. Her lovers, de Liagre and Argyle, flipped a coin to see who would accompany her to the port. De Liagre won, seeing her off, while Argyle swooped down in his plane, showering her with rose petals as a parting gesture. But tragedy struck just hours after her departure. Argyle's plane crashed, and he died in the wreckage. Unaware of the tragedy, Lee sailed toward Paris, her future in the city of light once again unknown. When Lee arrived in Paris, her fierce determination to learn from Man Ray thrust her into the heart of an artistic revolution. With characteristic boldness, she marched straight into his studio, only to be informed that he was on vacation. Crestfallen, she wandered across the street to a cafe, her mind racing. Then, as if summoned by fate, Man Ray appeared. He just seemed to rise out of the floor, she later recalled. Without hesitation, she introduced herself. "I'm your new student." Man, taken aback, responded with a dismissive tone. "I don't take students, and anyway, I'm off on holiday." Lee's reply was swift and defiant. "I know, and I'm coming with you." That audacity sparked not just a mentorship, but a passionate affair. Soon they were inseparable, lovers who intertwined their intimate and creative lives, making love between shoots, their bodies and art becoming inextricably linked. Man Ray, known for his meticulous, avant-garde style, found in Lee a partner who could match his artistic intensity. In the early days of their affair, they rarely left the studio, alternating between creating surrealist masterpieces and deepening their personal bond. Man was drawn not just to Lee's beauty, but to her insatiable hunger for artistic knowledge. As she quickly mastered his techniques, Man began to rely on her more, allowing her to take on his portraiture and advertising commissions. Their collaboration blurred the lines between teacher and student, artist and muse. Lee's rapid proficiency in photography stunned Man. He taught her the delicate art of manipulating light, composition, and perspective, pushing the boundaries of traditional photography. But soon, Lee was no longer just his apprentice. They worked side by side, often to such a degree that it became impossible to distinguish their individual contributions. "It's hard to say who took what photo," Lee would later reflect, her voice a mixture of pride and ambiguity, acknowledging the deep creative symbiosis between them. Their relationship, as intense as their art, grew tumultuous. Man was both captivated and consumed by Lee. His camera sought to capture her from every angle, every fragment of her being. His portraits of her focused not only on her beauty, but dissected it. Each feature explored, each detail fractured and reimagined. But Man's obsession was double-edged. His admiration for Lee soon twisted into a desire to control her. He idolized her but feared losing her freedom. This tension exploded over a photograph of Lee's neck, an image that would become iconic in Man Ray's body of work. After a heated argument about the image's concept, each claiming ownership of the idea, Man, in a jealous rage, slashed the photograph and covered it in red paint. He then pinned it to the studio wall, a dramatic display of both his possessiveness and the growing rift in their relationship. It was a visceral act of frustration, not only over the photo, but over his inability to contain the ever-elusive Lee. Man's jealousy deepened with time. His once celebrated acceptance of Lee's independence, her other lovers, and her vibrant spirit began to erode. His letters became desperate confessions of his inner turmoil. "You are so young and beautiful and free, and I hate myself for trying to confine you," he wrote, acknowledging the struggle between his love for her and his suffocating need to possess her. Despite his declarations, the tension between them simmered, growing more unbearable with each passing day. "I have promoted everything that would be to your advantage or pleasure, even when there was danger of losing you," he admitted, torn between nurturing her talent and holding on to her. Yet, amidst their personal conflicts, their artistic partnership continued to thrive. One fateful day in the darkroom, Lee accidentally flipped on the light, exposing a series of negatives. But instead of discarding the ruined images, they decided to develop them. What emerged was a revelation. A partial reversal of blacks and whites, a strange ethereal effect that enhanced the contours of the subject. This mistake led to the discovery of solarization, a technique that would forever mark their work. The surreal, dreamlike quality it gave their photographs heightened the surrealist elements both were striving for. While the credit for this technique was often debated, Lee's role was undeniable. "I don't know if I did it," she later mused. "At times, we were almost the same person. As their art evolved, so did their emotional distance." Man's increasing need to confine Lee clashed with her desire to break free. Their relationship reached a breaking point when Lee accepted a role in Jean Cocteau's Surrealist film The Blood of a Poet, where she played a plaster statue that comes to life and inspires the poet before driving him into madness. Man Ray was livid. "You don't lend out your mistress," he scolded, his jealousy veiling his fear of losing her completely. But Lee was already slipping away, finding her own voice as an artist. Her photography, while not strictly surrealist, captured familiar scenes from unsettling angles, bending reality and turning the mundane into something absurd. Her mastery of light and shadow, combined with her modernist approach, allowed her work to stand apart from Man's. The images she produced were provocative and original, reflecting the strength of her artistic identity, which had begun to outgrow her relationship with Man Ray. Through her growing social circle, Lee Miller was introduced to Aziz Eloui Bey, an Egyptian businessman whose presence would leave a lasting imprint on her life. Aziz, despite being married, pursued Lee with an intensity that mirrored the allure of Paris itself. Their affair blossomed, filled with whispered promises and lavish evenings at glamorous soirees. Aziz, with his wealth and connections, opened doors for Lee, introducing her to the glittering elite of the time. He promised her the world, and for a while, it seemed as though he might actually deliver it. By the winter of 1931, Lee's photographic career was flourishing. She had begun to establish herself as a portraitist, and her name was whispered among the avant-garde circles of Paris and beyond. Sitters came to her studio, seeking to be immortalized through her lens. London called, and she was set to work at L Street Studios, capturing stills and shooting backgrounds for the film Istanbul. It was a thrilling period of artistic growth, one that only fueled her ambition. During this time, she reached out to Man Ray for advice. His letters, however, remained entangled in personal longing. "I haven't felt this way since I was a teenager," he confessed in one letter, struggling to reconcile his emotions. Despite his acceptance of Lee's independence, jealousy gnawed at him. "I will be everything you want me to be and allow you to do all you want," he pleaded, as if offering his very soul in exchange for her continued affection. But Man Ray could only possess Lee in art, never in life. He watched helplessly as she became more involved with Aziz and the intoxicating whirlwind of Parisian society. His jealousy festered, dismissing Aziz as nothing more than an aging man who couldn't appreciate Lee's artistic brilliance. "He's too old for you," Man Ray scoffed. "He makes you promises he can't keep, and he doesn't care about your work." Man's increasing torment was palpable. His unreciprocated love for Lee spiraled into obsession. He began drinking heavily, often threatening violence against anyone he perceived as a rival. The desperation bled through his letters as he oscillated between professions of undying love and sharp rebukes. "You started off on a different career with me," he wrote bitterly, "and now all the simplicity of it has been ruined. I have loved you terrifically, jealously, until it has reduced every other passion in me. I have tried to make you a compliment to myself, but these distractions have made you waver, lose confidence in yourself. You are getting under someone else's control. You must arrange to live as my wife. I cannot see you any other way." Yet Lee was already slipping beyond his grasp, embracing the freedom that Aziz allowed her. She traveled to St. Moritz with Charlie Chaplin, encountering Aziz once again, their bond deepening amid the snow-covered mountains. Aziz, nearly 20 years her senior, wrote to Lee with a mixture of tender affection and passionate devotion. Unlike Man Ray, Aziz did not seek to contain her wild spirit, but rather to celebrate it. However, their affair was not without its own drama. Aziz's wife, devastated by his request for a divorce, attempted to end her life, casting a shadow over their romance. By 1932, Lee knew it was time for a change. Aziz returned to Cairo, and she prepared to leave Paris for New York, where she had 2 backers that would support her in her studio. The city of light, which had given her so much, now felt constricting, like a beautiful cage. Man Ray, aware that their time together was drawing to a close, spiraled into a deep depression. One of his final gestures was an eerie, haunting artwork. He sketched Lee's face in his notebook, tracing her eyes and mouth again and again, as though trying to capture her essence before she slipped away. He scrawled her name across the page, Elizabeth, 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 before finally writing, "Accounts never balance. One never pays enough. Love, Man." On the reverse side, he drew an eye, the symbol of his obsession, and added a cryptic note. "P.S. October 11th, 1932, with an eye always in reserve. Material indestructible, forever being put away. I am always in reserve." This was Man's final plea, his art becoming an extension of his torment. His desperation culminated in a dramatic outburst in front of Jacqueline Barsotti. "He slammed a gun onto the table," Barsotti recalled. He was unraveling, emotionally spent. "He put the pistol to his head, ropes around his neck. I had no idea if he would go through with it. I just took the picture. It summed up the moment perfectly." The image, stark and unsettling, would become iconic. A man desperate and hopeless at the end of a love affair. Lee's departure for New York marked the end of an era. Lee's journey, though intertwined with Man Ray's, was now leading her toward new horizons, but the two would meet again. As she embarked on the next phase of her career, she was more than ready to take on the world, unshackled, independent, and ever-evolving as an artist. Lee Miller's return to New York in 1932 wasn't a mere homecoming. It was the opening of a new chapter in her tempestuous life. She rented a double studio in the city, employing her brother Eric as her assistant, and quickly made her mark in the November issue of Vogue. Eager to distinguish her studio, she branded it as the American branch of the Man Ray School of Photography, which provoked fury in Man, feeling she was cynically attempting to cash in on his name. Yet Miller was undeterred. Her studio flourished, with high society streaming in through connections at the Levy Gallery, Condé Nast, and her benefactors. Soon, she was photographing New York's creme de la creme. In this swirl of success, Miller had her first solo photography show, a one-woman exhibition where she unveiled images from Paris and New York, capturing the soul of her subjects with her characteristic precision. Critics showered her with praise, but despite the accolades, sales were meager. The endless work of running the studio, combined with the emotional toll of her life, began to erode her energy. Her father, Theodore, ever her protector, whisked her off to a sanatorium for rest cures. But even this respite failed to restore her fully. Over the years, she had had several pregnancies, all of which she terminated, adding to her body's fatigue. Her commercial work, though precise and sought after, had begun to stifle her. In the American market, where customers demanded straightforward, grounded images, there was little room for the surrealism that had once thrilled her in Paris. Miller's artistry was cornered by practicality. What had been an exciting and revolutionary art form in Europe was now considered disconcerting and strange in New York. The vibrancy of her creative spirit dimmed as her work shifted towards the conventional, and she filled the artistic void with social escapades. New York's nightlife offered a glittering escape, a whirl of late-night poker games and smoky gatherings with theater people, models, and artists, all set to the jazz-infused pulse of the city. Her physical health reflected the strain. Long hours, endless parties, and the bitter burn of bootleg liquor left her frequently ill. Her social calendar brimmed with admirers, her main lover being literary agent named John Rodell. By the age of 26, Vanity Fair had named her one of the 7 most distinguished photographers alive. Despite this, her restlessness only grew when she learned that her old lover, Aziz Eloui Bey, an Egyptian diplomat, was coming to New York. She abruptly closed her studio and retreated to what was then called a fat farm, shedding 15 pounds in 2 weeks. And the two rekindled their affair. She introduced him to her parents and celebrated her father's birthday. But the nature of her relationship with Aziz remained unspoken until one day she nonchalantly asked her mother, "How do you like Aziz?" When Florence responded favorably, Lee dropped her bombshell. "Good, because I married him." The marriage, like much in Lee's life, was unconventional. They married in Manhattan on July 19, 1934, in a civil ceremony hastened by an official who warned her against marrying a black foreigner. Infuriated by the prejudice, Lee had the paperwork expedited and married Aziz later that day in a Muslim ceremony at the Egyptian consulate. He was 43, she was 27. She decided to close her studio and move to Egypt with him, leaving behind her brother Eric, now jobless. When she offered to turn the gallery over to Man Ray, he responded coldly, "Pull your own chestnuts out of the fire." With that, her New York chapter closed. By 1934, a pattern had emerged. Periods of frenetic work, followed by emotional and physical collapse. She entered her marriage to Aziz as though it were a retreat from the world. But it soon became clear that serenity could not be found within the gilded confines of Cairo. Writing to her brother, she confessed that she had come to loathe photography, abandoning her camera for months. In Cairo, her Parisian glamour intrigued the French-speaking elite, and she and Aziz spent their time amidst high society. They played bridge with royalty and flew to Jerusalem and San Moritz to escape the oppressive heat. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed. Aziz wrote to her parents, "Lee is happy, but it is not easy for her to settle down with her troubled soul." To the women of the harem, Lee was an anomaly, a woman unbound by the suffocating traditions that kept them cloistered from the world. Lee moved freely, mixing with men and women alike, offering glimpses of life beyond the walls. Her own life, however, remained troubled. It's believed that she suffered a miscarriage during her first year of marriage, and the pain lingered both in her body and in her heart. Her letters home described physical discomfort, aching joints, and a sense of being aged before her time. As the political atmosphere in Egypt grew tense with Italy's annexation of Ethiopia, Lee felt increasingly trapped. Anti-British sentiment surged and protests swelled in the streets. Lee herself spent 2 months bedridden, struck down by illness. But when she recovered, she flung herself into Cairo's nightlife, frequenting bars and defying the sexual conventions of the city. Aziz, unable to contain her, let her roam as she pleased. She was a force that could not be tamed. In 1937, her love for photography reawakened, as if stirred by the desert winds. She took excursions into the vast, silent landscapes of Egypt, capturing the stillness of ruins, the enduring faces of its people, and the endless horizon of sand. The trips gave her solace, a brief reprieve from the constraints of her life in Cairo. That summer, she traveled to France and attended a costume ball where she ran into Man Ray, who embraced her warmly. At the party, she was also introduced to Roland Penrose, a surrealist painter and writer. Penrose, having admired her work through Man Ray, was captivated not only by her art, but by her beauty. They quickly became entwined, and the magnetic pull of their shared creative passions was irresistible. When Roland left France, he invited Lee to join him in England, and Lee, along with Man Ray and his new lover, crossed the Channel to spend July with Penrose. Though she sent vague reassurances to Aziz, her heart was now drawn into the vibrant bohemian world of Roland and the Surrealists. They lived in a realm where free love was celebrated as a gateway to artistic freedom, and Roland, whose first affair was with a man, and his marriage had never been consummated due to his wife's unusual anatomy, found with Lee a muse who ignited his deepest desires. Their affair flourished in a dreamlike haze, and the couple and their friends practiced open love, believing that through this they could free their creative powers. The lovers then traveled along the Riviera, where they visited Picasso and mingled with the leading artists of the day. Man Ray, Lee, Roland, and others photographed each other, while after making love to Picasso, he immortalized her in several paintings. By September, the summer faded, and with it, the sun-drenched days of freedom. Lee returned to Cairo, but her heart was still in France. Writing to Roland, she poured out her frustration. "My tears, unlike your chains, bind me. It is true I love you, and I will return." Their correspondence deepened, their love intensified, and her dissatisfaction with her life in Egypt grew. Cairo now felt suffocating, and she longed for the artistic freedom and passion she had found with Roland. On her voyage back to Egypt, she had an affair with an officer on the ship, further signaling her growing distance from her husband. At home with Aziz, their marriage was unraveling. Their once close bond had faded, and she confided in Roland through daily letters. Aziz, sensing the shift, became irritable, and they no longer slept together. Lee wrote to Roland, "When I got married, I really did it for better or worse. But with that idea blown by the summer, my always doesn't seem to mean much anymore." Aziz, ever the diplomat, tried to rekindle their relationship with trips across the country, but Lee's heart was no longer in it. She was restless, craving the wildness of her past. Even her audacious display of Picasso's portrait of her in Cairo, a scandalous act that caused outrage, did little to stir her emotions. In 1938, Lee's behavior became increasingly reckless. She flouted societal conventions, openly flaunting her affairs. Cairo's high society was scandalized, and rumors swirled as Lee carried on with abandon. As the threat of war loomed over Europe, Cairo too was caught in a web of espionage and tension, yet Lee remained indifferent. She found her solace not in people, but in the desert, where the vast emptiness mirrored her inner turmoil. By the summer of 1939, the winds of war had reached their peak, and Lee reunited with Roland in Greece. Sailing through the islands together, their love was rekindled, but the world was changing fast. Mussolini had joined forces with Hitler, and Europe teetered on the edge of war. Roland urged her to return to England, to leave Egypt behind. In May 1939, she finally sailed for England, leaving Aziz behind, promising him it was just a holiday, though both knew that her departure was something more permanent. She arrived in England in June 1939, reuniting with Roland Penrose as the world teetered on the brink of war. The air buzzed with a sense of impending doom. With tensions mounting, many in their circle retreated to country estates for safety, while Aziz suggested they take refuge in St. Moritz. But Lee and Roland, ever drawn to the thrill of danger, had other plans. By late July, they were en route to visit Picasso, stopping by to see Max Ernst along the way. Their visit was shadowed by Ernst's arrest shortly after their departure, a sign of the unraveling world order. The once vibrant Surrealist scene, a realm they had sought to disrupt with art and rebellion, was collapsing under the weight of fascism. When Hitler invaded Poland, Lee and Roland made a hurried escape, boarding the last boat to England. They arrived on September 3rd, just in time to hear the air raid sirens wail as Britain declared war on Germany. The war had arrived, and Lee, who had always lived on the edge of convention, was about to live on the edge of war. She wrote to Aziz, bluntly stating that she would wage her war from London, and informed her father that she wouldn't be returning home to America. As a foreigner, Lee couldn't enlist, but Roland joined the Air Raid Patrol Corps, installing a bomb shelter in their garden, where they listened to the ominous hum of enemy planes overhead. The winter of 1939 was the harshest in decades, with the Thames freezing solid. During this frozen time, Lee took up work at British Vogue. In 1940, as the magazine struggled to stay afloat, she captured fashion amidst the chaos. Dress patterns, haute couture, and celebrities graced her lens, even as bombs dropped around them. With France fallen to the Nazis, London was under siege. Despite the destruction, Lee found herself entranced by the surreal spectacle of war. She photographed fiery clouds and skeletal buildings, caught between ruin and resilience. Vogue's office itself was hit by incendiary bombs, and Lee, ever undeterred, photographed the charred remains for the magazine, her images a poignant testament to British defiance. The Ministry of Information soon took notice of her work, enlisting her to photograph Blitz-ravaged London for a book aimed at galvanizing American support for the war. Titled Grim Glory, the book featured her haunting depictions of bombed-out churches, shattered homes, and cafes turned to rubble. Her work brought the stark reality of war into the glossy pages of Vogue, bridging the worlds of high fashion and high stakes. It was dedicated to Winston Churchill himself. As the Blitz raged on, Lee and Roland opened their home to friends who had lost everything. Among them was Roland's ex-wife, Valentine Penrose, who saw in Lee the courage to face whatever came her way. Yet, even as Lee took on these war assignments, she felt the frivolity of fashion photography weighing on her. She longed to do more. Her work now turned to documenting women in wartime, factory workers, mechanics, and the women of the Royal Navy. She captured the transformation of gender roles, showing women driving tractors, thatching roofs, and regulating torpedoes. The war had reshaped society, and through her lens, Lee chronicled this change. In 1943, Lee's war photography reached new heights. She documented American nurses in Britain, the Women's Land Army, and even photographed a regiment of women operating searchlights in the dead of night. Alongside David Sherman, a fellow photographer from Life magazine, who had moved in with Lee and Roland, becoming Lee's lover. Lee's photos often appeared in both Vogue and Life magazine, their names interchangeable on each other's work. Together, they staged photographic stories, recreating scenes if they missed the perfect shot. But there was no faking the rawness of what Lee captured. Her book, Wrens in Camera, chronicled the extraordinary work of women during the war, from mechanics to meteorological experts. She profiled the Duchess of Kent and even photographed the legendary broadcaster Edward Murrow. As the war ground on, Lee's yearning to be closer to the action deepened. She secured accreditation as British Vogue's official war correspondent. In early 1944, Lee pushed to be allowed to travel to the front. D-Day was looming, and although women weren't permitted to join the press corps at the front lines, Lee refused to be left behind. By the end of July, she was finally allowed to cross into France, documenting the post-invasion work of American nurses. Driving through a landscape strewn with barbed wire and skull and crossbones signs, she photographed the wreckage left in the wake of the war machine. In field hospitals, she captured the harrowing aftermath. Burned soldiers wrapped in bandages, surgeons and nurses working tirelessly, and soldiers lying in bed sleeping or smoking trying to feel alive. It was in these moments, as she stood amidst the suffering and destruction, that Lee realized how deeply war had altered her. Her photography pulled no punches. She captured the grotesque beauty of war, the surreal devastation it wrought, and in doing so, brought a new perspective to the pages of Vogue. Her images were a far cry from the high society portraits she had once taken, but they resonated deeply, plunging readers into the gritty reality of what war had wrought. In August, Lee traveled to Brittany, reaching the city of San Malo just as the Germans launched their final defense of the citadel. Street fighting raged around her, with snipers hidden in high towers, and Lee found herself right at the front lines, photographing the destruction and chaos. She stayed with the American troops, even as bullets flew overhead, capturing the tension and terror of a city under siege. When the Germans finally surrendered, Lee was there to photograph their defeated general, though he hid his face from her lens. Covered in dust and grime, Lee was unrecognizable as the glamorous model she had once been. But her resolve never faltered. Her photographs of the siege of San Malo were the only images taken by a woman in the combat zone. For that, she was exiled, a memo from the Allied command forbidding female correspondents from the front lines. As Paris celebrated its liberation, Lee's return to the city that had once been her artistic playground was bittersweet. "It is very bitter for me to go to Paris," she wrote, "now that I have a taste for gunpowder." The city was free, but the war was far from over. And for Lee Miller, the battlefields she had walked through would haunt her long after the cameras stopped clicking. After the liberation of Paris, Lee Miller threw herself into her work, capturing the heartbeat of a city slowly coming back to life. Her camera roamed the streets, photographing sandbags stacked around Notre Dame, women cycling past bullet-ridden buildings, and barbed wire cutting through the Parisian skyline. The city's defiant beauty, scarred yet proud, unfolded before her lens. At her hotel, Lee frequented the bar, mingling with the Time Life crew and Ernest Hemingway, and continuing her affair with David Sherman. Paris was a place of contrasts. On one corner, the city was jubilant in celebration, while on another, a sniper and a partisan engaged in a deadly duel. The rhythmic clatter of wooden clogs on cobblestone streets filled the air, as leather had grown scarce during the years of occupation. Picasso, upon seeing her again, remarked on the transformation in her. "This is the first Allied soldier I've seen," he said, half joking, "and it's you." He expressed a desire to paint her once more. Lee, meanwhile, documented the return of Parisian fashion, women in brightly colored dresses that defied the somberness of war. But the restless energy that defined her life soon returned, and Paris, for all its charm, began to feel too small. She set off to photograph German soldiers surrendering outside Orléans, her sights set on a world still embroiled in conflict. When Roland Penrose arrived in Paris, their reunion was charged with emotion, a mix of joy and sorrow. Though happy to see him, Lee's heart was divided. Roland feared that her affair with David had eclipsed their bond, but there was little time for reflection. Vogue demanded her attention. Fashion still thrived amid the wreckage, and Lee was tasked with photographing the October collections. Yet her desire to continue reporting on the war clashed with the magazine's insistence on glamour and celebrity. In October, Lee seized the chance to visit Luxembourg, where fighting raged on. General Eisenhower had ordered a full assault on the German defenses. With the 329th Regiment, she trudged through the muddy, battle-worn land, capturing the faces of refugees, civilians clinging to survival, and German soldiers attempting to blend into the crowd, their defeat imminent. Back in Paris, a rare moment of peace came when Lee interviewed Colette, the celebrated writer, photographing her with her husband. The interview captured the spirit of survival and artistry, even as Europe burned. Lee's duality as both war correspondent and fashion photographer allowed her to bridge two worlds, one of creation and the other of destruction. Her work on the liberation of France, juxtaposed against the resilience of fashion, was a testament to the endurance of both beauty and strength. Her next assignment was a far darker journey. Lee visited Struthof, one of the Nazis' lesser-known concentration camps, where the brutal reality of war hit her full force. As she traveled through the camp, documenting the emaciated survivors and the harrowing conditions they endured, she was overcome with the stench of death that clung to every corner. Struthof marked a turning point in her war work, plunging her into the abyss of human suffering. She carried a gas can filled with French brandy as she moved through the battlefields and liberated towns, a small comfort amid the overwhelming sorrow. In the bitter winter of 1944, she joined the U.S. command as they pushed through the Colmar Pocket, one of the war's bloodiest campaigns. She photographed villages ravaged by hand-to-hand combat, civilians caught in the crossfire. Lee's fury deepened as she walked through streets filled with rubble and the dead, the remnants of Hitler's empire crumbling around her. The Germans, dazed and broken, claimed ignorance of the horrors inflicted in their name. Their denial enraged her. "The Germans are schizophrenics," she said. "I glare at their blossoms and plowed fields," she wrote to Roland, "and work myself up into such hate that I have no kindness when I come to their victims." She photographed entire families who had taken their own lives beneath portraits of Hitler, the Führer's shadow still looming even in death. From Frankfurt, Lee and David Sherman pressed on to Dachau, where they found one of the darkest corners of the war. The camp was a horror beyond words. Lee's camera captured the first steps of freedom for those who could still walk, while others lay in their bunks, too weak to move. Dutch prisoners raised their arms in victory, while SS officers tried to melt into the crowd, pretending to be prisoners. Their disguises futile as the real prisoners hunted them down. After Dachau, Lee and Sherman reached Munich, where Hitler's home was now under Allied control. It was here that Lee famously took her bath in Hitler's tub, an act of defiance, as if scrubbing off the filth of all she had seen. The juxtaposition of the absurd and the horrific was captured in a single photograph, Lee lounging in the dictator's bathtub, a stark reminder of the strange contrasts of war. From there, she sped off to Salzburg in a Mercedes convertible, arriving just in time to see Hitler's mountain retreat engulfed in flames, set ablaze by retreating SS officers. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with the surrender of Germany. Lee's story appeared in Vogue's Victory issue that June, chronicling the shattered towns, the castles, and the absolute devastation that she had witnessed. Her words and photographs became an indelible record of the war's end, preserving both the beauty and the brutality of a world reborn from the ashes of conflict. Even as the war concluded, Lee's inner battles raged on. She had seen too much, felt too deeply, and the darkness that followed her through the war would never fully release its grip. Each photo she took was a testament to her struggle to find meaning in the aftermath of destruction. But the more she searched, the more she found only shadows, ghosts of a world that had lost its way, and a photographer who had lost her own compass in the process. Vogue's patience waned. Their requests for elegant post-war glamour met with grim reality. Lee's funding was cut, and she was advised that Roland had taken up with another woman. Lee pushed everything aside, ignoring the reality, and continued her journey to Romania, where she photographed gypsy music, village life, and an absurd local practice, bear massages, where trained bears walked on people's backs. She reveled in the peculiarity, but her heart lay with the peasants, those who had weathered the storm with strength and silence. Then came the letter from Roland, sharp and unforgiving. "You asked me before if I loved another woman," he wrote. "Well, I do now, and she is real, no ghost as you are." Her heart faltered at his ultimatum: return to him or lose him forever. After 18 months of drifting across the scarred landscape of Eastern Europe, Lee returned to London, to Roland. Though their relationship was strained, and though they would try, they would never recapture the spark they had in the days they traveled down the Mediterranean in their group of Surrealists with the world at peace. That winter, as Lee neared her 40th birthday, her emotions swung wildly between rage and despair. The post-war world, with its trivialities, sickened her. Her writing, once raw and defiant, was edited beyond recognition, reduced to fashion tips and travel notes. The war clung to her like an old lover, refusing to let go. She could not adjust to the mundanity of peace, and David Sherman, watching from a distance, predicted her collapse. "Soon, she's going to break to pieces like a bum novel," he wrote. In May 1946, Lee and Roland flew to New York. There, Condé Nast staff celebrated her homecoming, while friends and family welcomed her as a heroine. But she felt nothing. The glories of Manhattan, the old parties with Max Ernst and Man Ray in Los Angeles, everything that had once sparkled now seemed tarnished. The joy had left her, and friends noted the change. Lee had aged, they said. The war wore her down. She gave interviews, she smiled for the cameras, but the fire inside her had dimmed. The world had moved on, and she felt left behind. She returned to Europe, continuing her work for Vogue, but her disdain for the trivial concerns of fashion deepened. "I detest the people who got fat off the war and now complain about nothing but trifles," she confided to Roland, longing for the days when combat boots were her uniform and purpose. Then, unexpectedly, she discovered she was pregnant. At 39, it was a revelation that stunned her. In a letter to Roland, she expressed her astonishment. "This is a hell of a romantic way to tell you I'll be knitting little clothes soon," she wrote. The pregnancy brought a new purpose, though she vowed her workroom would not become a nursery. Roland, too, felt the weight of impending fatherhood and proposed marriage. Lee, finally divorcing Aziz, agreed. Some whispered that the baby was her way of keeping Roland and for her to find a new purpose. But then again, some people always whisper. Aziz arrived in London with the quiet dignity that had defined their relationship. The divorce was finalized with mutual grace and respect, an end to a chapter that had lingered but was now resolved without bitterness. On May 3, 1947, Lee and Roland were married in a simple, intimate ceremony. There were no grand celebrations, just the quiet acknowledgement of a life together, now bound by love and shared history. As Lee's pregnancy progressed, however, her age became a concern. A cesarean section was planned, and with her typical pragmatism, Lee prepared for every possibility. The night before the surgery, she wrote her dawn confession, a letter to Roland in case she did not survive. In it, she bared her heart. "I didn't waste a minute," she assured him. "If I had to do it all again, I'd be even freer with my ideas, body, and affection. I'd have let you, Roland, know how much and how passionately I love you." The letter was raw and honest, a reflection of the woman who had lived so fiercely and fully. She also penned a poignant message to her mother, expressing regret for the rebellious girl she had once been, and wishing deeply that her mother could now be by her side, sharing in this transformative moment. On September 9, 1947, Lee gave birth to Anthony William Penrose. The arrival of their son, a tiny beacon of light, brought joy and a rare moment of clarity to Lee's increasingly tumultuous existence. Yet even as she held her newborn, the weight of the past, the shadows of war, loss, and survival persisted. Those dark memories, as with so many who had seen the horrors of the camps, would never leave her and would tarnish her relationship with the son she now held in her arms. Motherhood and work became an uneasy balancing act. Her standout piece during this period was a profile on Peggy Guggenheim, Roland's former lover, and the woman who had heroically saved countless works of modern art during the war. Peggy's palazzo brimmed with art, and despite Peggy's history with Roland and Max Ernst, Lee found herself drawn to her. In 1949, the family moved to Farley Farm, a 20-acre sanctuary Roland bought for £20,000. The picturesque setting became both a retreat and a prison for Lee. She commuted to London, still producing 8 pieces a year for Vogue, but the world of fashion no longer thrilled her. Scarves, autumn clothes, the minutiae of bourgeois life, all of it left her empty. Her colleagues found her increasingly difficult, her temper sharp and unpredictable, fueled by heavy drinking. The doctor gave her little solace. "Let the war go," he said. Today, they would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Then, it was simply something to drown in a bottle. Roland, ever the devoted artist, wrote that photography had once been Lee's passion, but had abandoned her after the war. Cooking became her new consolation. But his accounts, elegant and detached, omitted the truth. Her violent rages, his affairs, the growing distance between them. Eventually, Roland intervened, asking Vogue to stop assigning her work. They complied, and her editor assured her she could always return. But Lee never did. Farley Farm became her canvas. She threw herself into its daily workings, managing staff, tending to animals, and cultivating vegetables. Her photographs from this period, tinged with both beauty and sadness, captured the stark limitations of rural life. Ex-lovers like Picasso and Max Ernst visited often, turning the farm into a salon of old friends and brilliant minds. Yet Lee found herself increasingly ill at ease, not built for the pastoral rhythm that consumed her days. Never complaining, a silent battle, a war waged against herself. Around this time, Roland began an affair with Dion, a model who moved into the house. Lee believed, naively perhaps, that this might save her marriage. Her libido had faded after childbirth, and she thought allowing Roland some freedom would keep him happy. But Dion, with her youth and sharp disdain, saw Lee as nothing more than a drunken relic. She judged Lee harshly, believing she had lost her beauty, her edge, and found her presence at the farm unsettling. Dion resisted Roland's advances at first, but soon, Roland fell deeply in love with her and Lee. once the object of his obsession, became an outsider in her own home. The affair devastated Lee. Roland eventually asked for a divorce, and in response, Lee collapsed into illness, retreating to her bed, demanding that Dion leave the farm. Dion departed for Paris, but Roland continued visiting her, a fact that gnawed at Lee's soul. Her world began to unravel even further when her mother, Florence, was diagnosed with cancer. Lee rushed back to America to be with her, but despite her care, Florence passed on September 11, 1954. The loss of her mother left a deep, unhealing wound, and she lingered in America for months, helping her father, now equally bereft. Returning to England, Lee helped Roland with his biography on Picasso, a task that brought them back together, though their relationship remained fraught. As their son Anthony would later write, they found they loved and needed each other, though they still found it hard to get on together. Dion remained in Roland's life, and though he attempted discretion, Lee always knew. Her anger, sharp as ever, often found its mark in her son Anthony. "I don't know what I represented to her, perhaps a reflection of her own self-loathing," Anthony later wrote. As Roland's reputation soared with successful shows and exhibitions, Lee's life slipped into the shadows. Her artistic career faded into memory, leaving her with insecurities and bitterness. She drank more heavily, and it was Dion's hold on Roland that hurt her the most. Friends urged her to pick up photography again, but she flatly refused. That part of her life was finished, she said. Instead, she turned to cooking, crafting elaborate meals that served as her creative outlet. Though she never pursued it professionally, her dishes became works of art in their own right. Perhaps the only thing that brought her a sense of peace. The only piece Lee wrote again was a tribute to Picasso. By then, she was almost invisible in social circles, attending events more as Roland's wife than as the legendary Lee Miller. Even when she attended the event where Prince Philip stood in for Picasso, the focus was on Roland. Her brief appearance in Vogue in the mid-1960s, where she discussed her recipes and culinary skills, did little to revive her sense of self. The accompanying photograph, taken just after she had replaced her front teeth and donned a wig, revealed a woman whose exterior no longer matched the fierce soul within. Shortly after, she underwent a facelift, reclaiming some of her old confidence, though Roland raged against it. At dinner, she would upbraid Roland for telling the same stories, or shout at Tony for being boring. We hated each other, and did it with such attention that it became an art form. We never missed a chance to assassinate each other's emotions, her son wrote. In 1966, Roland was knighted, and Lee became Lady Penrose. The irony was not lost on her. She answered the phone with exaggerated delight, but the title felt hollow, a final punctuation to a life that had somehow drifted away. Her creativity found small outlets in the form of cooking competitions, which she won with regularity, but these were pale imitations of her past triumphs. As Roland began an affair with a 22-year-old woman, Lee accepted it with indifference. Their intimacy had ended years earlier, and she no longer fought to hold on to him. She even invited the young woman to the farm, striking up an odd friendship. It was a hollow peace, as Dion still flitted in and out of Roland's life. In 1971, Lee's father, Theodore, passed away, and with his death, something vital within her broke. The complex, intimate relationship they had shared had long been a source of both pride and pain, and his loss deepened her despair. Cooking remained her anchor, as she appeared in magazines discussing her surrealist recipes and culinary innovations. When her son married, his wife played peacemaker, and the two began to repair their relationship. "We would never have a typical mother and son relationship, but like enemies that become friends, we had a lot in common," he wrote. By the time Man Ray held his retrospective in 1976, Lee had receded from the public eye. Roland's tribute to him mentioned Lee only as his muse, despite her critical role in his innovations. But Man Ray, ever sentimental, included many of her photographs and called her his favorite model. At 85, Man Ray grew ill and was confined to a wheelchair in Paris. Lee visited him daily. She would sit on his bed, and they would talk of the past, or they would sit in silence for hours with her holding his hand. Both Max Ernst and Man Ray passed away in 1976, adding to the loss of Picasso 3 years earlier. The world they had once reveled in was disappearing. Roland found solace in his mistress, claiming Lee was boring. While Lee withdrew further into her solitude, cooking or sitting alone for hours. Yet in 1977, a small light appeared. Her granddaughter, Amy Valentine Penrose, was born on April 25th, 2 days after Lee's 70th birthday. It was a brief moment of joy in an otherwise darkened world, but by June, Lee's health had deteriorated. Diagnosed with cancer, she spent her final days in bed, with Roland always by her side. In her last weeks, Lee reconciled with Anthony, apologizing for the anger she had so often directed at him. They shared a rare moment of peace and understanding. On July 21st, 1977, at dawn, Lee Miller passed away in Roland's arms. Her ashes were scattered across the grounds of Farley Farm, where Roland, with a quiet reverence, spread them in all the places she had loved. "I want her to be everywhere," he whispered, tossing her ashes into the air, watching as they caught the breeze, carried on the wind, and settled gently across the fields. Her presence forever lingering, a part of the earth, the air, and the life she had so deeply touched. Thank you for watching this video on Lee Miller. If you enjoy content like this, please don't forget to like, share, or subscribe. As a small channel, your support truly makes a difference. You can also find us on Patreon, where we offer a weekly podcast, ad-free videos, and exclusive new content every month. A huge thank you to all our patrons and to everyone who stayed with us until the end. Your support means the world to us. Please take care of yourselves. I love you all. Stay safe, and as always, thank you for watching.